I think it's done. I'm recording.
Yes.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks. Thanks, Carol. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to everyone who's come along today and to hear what we're doing in ADAPT on Irish Language Technology. And I suppose there's a few motivations behind wanting to take part in the seminar. So firstly is to, I guess, highlight the progress we've made over the past few years in terms of our work in Irish language technology. And also I'm aware there's new members who might have an interest in Irish language, some from overseas who don't know a lot about what we do in Irish. And it's been a while since I've talked about the team and what we've done, so I thought it was time for an update. And also would like to highlight the data sets that we have available in case some people might be interested in collaborating or using the data sets. Or even just giving feedback or advice is all very welcome. And then finally, most importantly, would be to introduce the team, the research team and that broader EU project team, so that everybody knows everybody and we feel part of the family. So let's see. Okay. I'll start off with an Irish language overview. So this is to remind everyone, even Irish people, where we're up to with Irish language. And then also for anyone who is new to the country. And I'll also give a status on technology in general. I'll talk about some current and past projects in ADAPT. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we've addressed some of the issues of lack of resources and scarcity. And then finally, just highlight some possibilities for the future in this area. So in terms of Irish language, it's the first official language of Ireland, and a lot of people might not be aware of that. So English is the second official language. It's our national language. On the census of 2016, so that's the last census, there's a population of 4.7 million people in Ireland. Out of that 4.7 million people, we had 1.7 million people profess to have the ability to speak Irish in the census. However, the daily usage, so those who say they would use Irish outside of the education system on a daily basis, is 73,800. And while it seems like quite a low number, and most of those people would be in the Gaeltachty region, so that on the map there, they're the darker green areas in the west of Ireland mainly. There is a Gaeltacht region in Waterford and one in Meath. Irish is on the increase in daily usage and in urban areas, and especially in the growth of Gael schooling across the country, we're going to see a resurgence of the use of language outside of school systems. So, and this of course applies to both the Republic and the North of Ireland. North of Ireland, there's an increase in uptake in Irish language, and it's a recognised minority language in the North of Ireland. In terms of its EU language, which works to our benefit, and we'll see as I go through the talk. We are deemed one of the lesser resource languages, and there's been more focus on that recently, thankfully, in a lot of the calls for funding to highlight a few languages that would be deemed lesser resource, and Irish being one of them. In terms of requirements for official translations, Ireland is a little bit different. And in terms of, or Irish language is different in terms of the need to produce all translations of all official documents. So at the moment there's a derogation. A derogation slowly being lifted in terms of meeting the full demands of translation. By the end of 2021, when we expect to have enough fully qualified translators on board, we will see the lifting of the derogation. So in 2012, just to give a little bit of history of where we're coming from with this and our motivation essentially for doing this work. In 2012, the MetaNet network, if you like, a European group, had a white paper series published, and it was based on a European survey across all 31 EU languages, and John Judge of ADAPT led the survey for the Irish language, and essentially each report had to give an insight into how well the language was supported technically. And if you'll forgive my dodgy table, and John and I have reused and used this table probably too many times, it needs an update, but the gist of it is we have four main areas that were being examined: so machine translation, text analysis, speech, and language resources. So they're then there along the left. And there are 5 main categories ranging from excellent to weak or no support. And you can see that Irish fell into the weaker no support category for most of these, apart from speech technology. And that's because of the good work that's been done in Trinity College in the School of Linguistics, Speech and Communication Sciences in terms of the development of speech synthesis. But overall, it's a pretty bleak picture for Irish. One of the main points that came out of that study, which really resonated with us, was this point made that the printing press resulted in the extinction of many regional and minority languages. And therefore, the question is, will technology have the same impact on the lesser resource languages of the world? And that would include Irish. So this term of the risk of digital extinction, it can be a controversial term for some people, and in some ways can be misinterpreted based on the context. But what's at play here, what's in question, is this idea that the language needs technical support to be used through technology if it wants to continue usage in our daily lives, because technology is prevalent in our daily lives. And if these basic, and these are absolutely basic, most of these, if these basic platforms, applications and tools are not available for use with our language, the risk is you revert then back to the major language. And in a bilingual context in Ireland like this, the major language that is defaulted to is English. And so there's a risk there that the language then goes into decline just because it's too difficult for people to try to communicate through technology if it's not supporting their language. So in ADAPT, we've had a number of current and past projects, but I'll just go back in time a little bit to what it was like back then in 2012, and then sort of the path forward from that and how we got to where we are. So when this survey was published, so I had started a PhD on tree banking and parsing, and started in 2011. And actually started it without a scholarship and without funding, because there was no interest in funding what I wanted to study. So I was told that Irish is not of major interest at the time to SFI. I guess essentially the message we were getting was that it's not economically viable, and the social impact wasn't being considered. So that stage we had CNGL, which is the Centre for Next Generation Localization, which was the former ADAPT at DCU. DCU itself had no interest in funding machine translation or NLP for Irish. Now in DCU, in Fionter, they do work on development of terminology databases and so forth. That's not what I'm talking about when I refer here to language technology. So I'm talking about systems, intelligent systems that can cope with processing human language and not a mere database lookup. And so the one PhD had come out in 2009 out of DCU, which we're very fortunate to have. Elena Dunica, she created the first morphological analyzer, part of Speech Tiger and Stemmer, which is fundamental to any further research in Irish language technology. But aside from that, there was no interest. And then finally, the EU projects at the time were not targeted, definitely not at Irish language technology or at the lesser resource languages. They weren't seen as fashionable or economically viable at the time either. So that was sort of the status quo in 2012. Roll on to 2014, John, Judge and I approached the Department of the Gaeltacht, and we asked them if they would consider giving us some money to do a pilot study on first ever English-Irish machine translation system. And it would be for use within public administration. And we're totally taking a gamble, because we in theory knew that it would work. If they gave us data, we'd train a system, but we had no idea if it would actually work that well. And we call the system the Tapador system. The pilot study was very successful. And the MT system is now in use for use by the in-house translators at the Department of the Gaeltacht. And by all means, any reports from the translators have been immensely positive, and in many cases they prefer the use of the MT system over the translation memory that they had in use. One major bonus for working or benefit from working with the department at this stage was that they were able to see firsthand the importance of sharing data and how this would lead to development of systems and reduction of costs. So they could see you could develop a system, lead to greater productivity, reduce their translation costs, increase bilingual content, which means they could share further data and then improve the system and so on. And it was of huge benefit, which we'll see as I talk about data collection, to have then the department behind us in fully understanding why it's important to collect data, and essentially the value behind any of this parallel previously translated data that's lying in government bodies, organizations, institutions all over the country, hidden gems, and nobody knew about them. So we have major scarcity challenges, and we're lacking in many areas, so funding being one of them. And the issue is, even if you get funding, we don't really have enough people to do the work. We don't have the skilled labor. It's a very niche set of skills. You need to have computer science, you need to have linguistics knowledge and understanding, and the Irish language. A bit of a holy grail, if you like. And it's so tied in with the lack of funding means that there's not enough courses, not enough training available. And so they've got this vicious circle. And what I wanted to point out, the reason I have the mutant there actually, is I want to highlight that Irish is an inflected language, and so that poses more difficulty when we are looking for data, because we need even more data, because words can have a lot of different variations in their forms. So we have prefixes, suffixes. In the Celtic languages, we have initial mutations, which basically means that the beginning of the word can change in numerous ways depending on the context. So that adds to the data sparsity, and the data scarcity, of course, is compounded by the fact that we do have a low number of speakers. There's not as much digital content available, and that digital content can be in the form of translated data or at the size of our Wikipedia. And also just in general, edited content online or user-generated content. So we don't have the same amount of digital content and data to work with, and our data sets are much smaller. As we all know, of course, in ADAPT, we are working with, most of us are working in the area of machine learning and deep learning, and so these are data-driven systems. And the data-driven systems rely on being able to observe patterns in language from having a lot of training data. So if you don't have a lot of training data, the system's not going to get so smart so quickly. So in ADAPT, of course, we have a lot of people working on a number of different languages, and some people working on multiple languages. And in most cases, they're all quite fortunate to have large data sets at their disposal, so that they don't have to worry about that side of things. They can move on to working on the experimental phases and trying out new algorithms. And however, this is not the case when we're working with Irish. So we have to create our own data sets first. And that takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, because the data sets are small. We need to make sure they're high quality. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done before even continuing to work with any of the latest state-of-the-art approaches. Now, I'll talk a little bit about some of the areas that we're working on. For the first 4 points there, these are research projects and areas in which we are scaling up essentially a new generation of technologists who can work with the Irish language. And then the final one is work based on data collection, which is thanks to EU funding. And as I said before, we are benefiting from having this official status in terms of being able to apply for this funding. For SFI funding through core funding in ADAPT, we have one PhD. So Megan is finishing up her PhD this year. Megan joined us during the Tapador project, that pilot project. And she's essentially taken Tapador and turned it into Tapador++. She is working on various areas of data collection, data filtering. So she's looking at different domains of the data to be used for training the system. She's compared statistical machine translation to neuro machine translation. She's looked at back translation as a method for creating synthetic data in order to overcome the lack of data available to her. Human evaluation, she's just completed the first human evaluation study of English-Irish machine translation, and currently looking at the inclusion of multi-word expressions in neuro machine translation, as well as writing up a thesis. So she's doing Trojan work, and Andy is supervising Megan with me on this project. The rest of our research funding comes from the Department of the Gaeltacht. So thanks to our pilot study, we were able to prove that our work and our research is not for research purposes. It's not for publishing something that could be left on the shelf. Like, we actually want to create stuff that could be reusable in the future and will have some sort of impact. So I applied for funding from the Department of the Gaeltacht, and we have now got a 4-year research program. It covers 3 research strands. So furthering the tree bank development from my PhD, furthering some work I did on a Fulbright scholarship where I was looking at the use of Irish on Twitter, and also looking into automatic processing of Irish multi-word expressions. So these would all fall under the general heading of NLP. So the tree bank expansion, the tree bank, we have 2 versions of the tree bank, essentially. One which is closely aligned to the Irish language, and the second version is based on the universal dependency. So anyone in the tree banking world or parsing world would understand what I mean by universal dependencies. One major issue when I talk about the lack of skills is that syntax is not actually widely covered in curriculum across universities, 3rd level institutions in Ireland. Trinity is probably the best place if you want to learn anything about syntax. And while we have a lot of linguistics and language courses across the country, syntax is not covered. So this is a major challenge, of course, then if we need people to learn how to annotate a tree bank. Sarah had a nice exposure during her Erasmus year to syntax for a couple of months. So she was a winner. And Sarah is a graduate of VCU languages, French and Irish. And Jason came from UL Applied Languages and has a number of other languages under his belt as well, a couple of polyglots. And so I guess with that linguistic expertise and strength behind them, they were able to pick this up relatively quickly. There was a steep learning curve, but now if you want to ask them about universal dependencies, they would be happy to talk at length about different linguistic phenomena in the Irish language. We are due to have the release in 2 days. Every 6 months we have a universal dependencies release. So version 2.6 will have almost 3,000 trees. And in terms of data sets, it might not seem like a lot, but let me tell you, it took 6 months to get 1,161 trees together and to make sure that they were gold standard. So it's a lot of work, a lot of effort, very niche area. So what we're trying to do now is to source new raw data for annotation, and we won't annotate from scratch, of course. We'll train a parsing model to pre-annotate the data, and so the guys will get busy correcting and manually correcting the data from here on. For our work on Irish on Twitter, on user-generated content, on Irish user-generated content, Lauren Cassidy joined us in September last year. And Lauren came from the computer science and language course in Trinity, which is our main source of computational linguists in this country. Our only source, I should say, because in 2005, DCU decided to very unwisely discontinue their computational linguistics degree. And so Lauren, fantastic person for this job because she is a fluent speaker, not a native speaker, which in some ways actually goes for benefit because she's able to observe data from an objective analysis point of view, and also is fairly prolific on social media, either through Irish or because of her musician background. So she was perfect selection for this job. And essentially what we're doing is we're looking at the fact that Irish is now have jumped on this social bandwagon. I've updated my social bandwagon, you'll see, with TikTok, just so it doesn't look like I don't know what the kids are up to these days. But we basically are looking at whatever, we have a collection of tweets, and whatever we have available to us, we're going to try and work through to observe the code switching element of English into Irish and how people will switch between the 2 languages online. And this is furthering the work that I had done before, but essentially what Lauren has to do now is she's expanding the part of speech tag corpus, and she's going to turn it into a tree bank, because once we're able to parse it, we're going to be able to see a little bit more information about the syntax and how the 2 languages interact in terms of syntax. So Irish is a VSO language, English is an SVO language, and this has never been examined before. And on top of that, any work has done previously on code switching in Irish has been carried out on recordings, transcribed recordings of Irish speech. This is a very different area altogether. And finally, of our postgrads, we have Abigail. Most of you would know because Abigail's been around with us for a couple of years. Abigail is doing Trojan work on looking at multi-word expressions in Irish. One of the big challenges that Abigail faces, which is what I had also faced in development in the tree bank, in Irish, in linguistics, there is a huge lack of theoretical linguistics available for us to draw from. And it is difficult to even find an answer to what is a multi-word expression, how one would categorize them. She's had to build a large lexicon, but compiling different sources, different lexica, different dictionaries, and all of these have various amounts of coverage or interpretations of multi-word expressions. She's tried to categorize them. Some of them don't fit into the general categories that are often used for other languages, so she's trying to figure out how to deal with these anomalies. And Irish, like any other language, has very cool, quirky multi-word expressions, and in particular the Irish copula causes great grief for us because it creates this idiomatic construction. So ismatlum, I like, actually means it's good with me. And so we're encountering some very interesting work here. She's just released her first tagged corpus. So this is an example of her in action here with the tagging of multi-word expressions in an Irish corpus. And we have, she's released 1,700 sentences. Out of that, there are 663 multi-word expressions. So that's part of the Parzim shared task for this year. And it's the first time Irish is part of that shared task. So that's an amazing achievement for Abigail. After this, what she's going to do is look to automating a system and building a system that will automatically be able to process multi-word expressions. So in terms of the other work that's going on, so we have managed to get some EU funding for Irish language technology. And this has basically grown out of the fact that we've been part of the European Language Resource Coordination since about 2015. And the coordinations and network across Europe, there's 2 representatives from each country, a technical national anchor point, which I've been playing the role of, and a public administration national anchor point from the Department of the Gaeltacht. And what we essentially have been doing is try to encourage people in public administration in each country, so we're looking after Ireland, to share and contribute their language resources. And basically what we're focusing on for the moment is the improvement of the e-translation system. So that's the former MT at EC, machine translation at the European Commission. So we're looking at trying to collect parallel data, previously translated high quality data from any of the institutes and organizations across the country who deal with Irish language. So we do have cooperation with a lot of public bodies, with the department, of course, with also the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. So they host the Open Data Unit, Dublin City Council, and so on. And out of that, we have applied, so following on from that, essentially, we've applied for funding from the Connecting Europe Facility funding projects, basically. So CEF have an automated translation strand, automated translation in the sense of trying to improve this e-translation system. So the specific funding is aimed at projects that will help with the collection of this data. And what you can see here is the inside of another holy grail, which is, this is a TMX file, so translation memory file, so where you have data correctly aligned. There's the English and there's the Irish, and this would be fantastic if we could get this from the departments and organizations across the country. The reality is we don't, because surprisingly most people don't use translation memories, or they can't find the translation memory or source them, so we end up getting PDFs or Word documents, and we do what we can with those. So the first CEF project Andy and I applied for funding for us and were successful. We partnered with Spain, Portugal and France, and ELRI stands for the European Language Resource Infrastructure. And essentially the purpose of this project was to develop an online portal where people would be encouraged and could upload any data that they could find on their servers and their own computers in different departments in order to share across all the other public institutions and when the licensing was cleared, so it could either be open source licensing or maybe some particular Creative Commons licensing. When the licensing was cleared, it would then be passed on to the ELRC for use in training the e-translation system. And that project finished last year in September. The principal project started up. So while the ELRI project was focusing on general public administration data, the principal project is focusing more on improving translation for e-justice. So we're looking at legal data. And so we're working closely with the RANOG. The RANOG is the translation department of the Houses of the Oireachtas of the Irish Parliament, and also the Department of Justice. And so that's where we get most of our legal data. Now we're working closely with Iconic as well on this. So we're training up machine translation systems to evaluate how good the data is and the combination of the data sets are before we pass them on to e-translation. And so the great thing about this is now bringing in extra funding, we're able to bring in more people. And so for the ELRI project, we have Jane. So Jane actually is a former DCU student in computational linguistics, and Jane successfully executed and managed the ELRI project for those 2 years with the help of Federico. Federico, I'm sure, will thank me for finding the most pensive picture I could find online. Federico, what's wonderful about this is Federico is obviously not Irish with the Italian name, but is provided with such great support, which you normally might not get from someone who doesn't speak Irish or feel the need to want to support the Irish language. So it's fantastic having the outside support and also an insight from another angle as well. And then of course Helen is a fluent Irish speaker, which works very well to her benefit when she's working with stakeholders and trying to disseminate and create awareness and information about the importance of sharing data. Now with the principal project, we've got the same super team, but we also have an addition to that, and it's the Holy Grail of Orla. So Orla is a Holy Grail because she's a software engineer and she speaks Irish, which is very hard to find, believe me, in our recruitment process. It's not that easy to find these people, and so we've got the A team together at the moment. And of course, Andy is the PI on these projects. So in terms of the scarcity of resources, lack of resources, and how we address them, in research I'm talking about, so we already know how we're trying to collect our data for machine translation. There are various ways in which we can look at addressing them. With our issue of the sparsity of data, the scarcity of data, in the past we've looked at cross-lingual transfer and its plan for the future, and also bootstrapping and synthetic data, and then obviously we're training up experts, which is vitally important as well. Cross-lingual transfer is when you use data from one language to help build a system for another language. That's less a resource. In the past, when I was developing the tree bank, and this is very much prior to word embedding days, I delexicalized the data from a lot of the UD tree banks. Now it's good to be part of a project where the tree banks are annotated according to a unified annotation scheme. So that the purpose is that you should be able to learn from one tree bank into another. So if you remove language specific information, you delexicalize them, you should be able to do some sort of cross-lingual transfer. Now with word embeddings, multilingual BERT and so on, we have a couple of people. The main parsing experts around DCU are Joachim Wagner and James Barry, who are now have taken an interest in working with the Irish data, so that's wonderful. And we've just sent them on the latest tree bank, and we're looking forward to hearing more good stories. There were some good stories a couple of months ago, so looking forward to an increase in the parsing accuracy this time around. In terms of work with multi-word expressions, Abigail then will be able to work with the other parsing corpora and use some of the linguistic information she can derive from the other languages as well. In terms of tree bank development, bootstrapping was the only way we could do it. It would just take too long. So when you bootstrap, basically you might train a substandard system to start off with. So say, for example, manually annotate 300 gold trees and then use that to train a system. It's not going to have very good accuracy, but then you can pre-parse your next raw text and then correct that instead of annotating from scratch. And we've done this in a circular approach. And we will do this now with the next data. We'll pre-parse and predict some of the annotations, so the guides will only have to correct it. There's various ways in doing this. So you could use semi-supervised learning, supervised learning. I did try active learning. It does work better than passive learning, but overall, if you are limited in your data, you're going to just take whatever data you can get. So it's not enough to say we will select the informative data that we get from comparing two systems. We will just take it anyway. So we're going with the regular passive learning. In terms of MT, so Megan has tried out the back translation study. She's based her work on successful work by Alberto Ponchelas, and also formerly of Team B. Well, he's in Team B, but he's just finished his PhD, who showed that back translation was a successful approach for creating parallel data. Wasn't so successful for Irish for a number of different possible reasons. We need to explore that a little bit more. Potentially because the domain of the monolingual data. So what happens with back translation is you would look at the target language, so in our case it's Irish, and you would take a large corpus of monolingual Irish data, put that through a system that's not the same as your own system. So we put it through an SMT system. We created a new then parallel data set and used that to add to the training set for the NMT system. It didn't work very well in that particular study, so it could be to do with the domain of the monolingual data compared to the test data, and maybe the data set sizes, so a lot more investigation into that would be needed. Possibilities for the future, so I think I've just run over the 30 minutes, so I'll go through this fairly quickly. I want to highlight here the importance of EPE for our team and for our work, and I also want to congratulate the team on how well they do. I'm sure Laura can contest, will verify, attest to that. She'll verify that the team are very active in EPE, and it comes from the need, the feeling and the need to explain to the Irish language public and the Irish public in general that there is a risk of digital extinction that most people aren't aware of, and there are many things that the general public can do. And so one would be, if you were a younger person, you consider studying STEM and combine an Irish language, which most people might not ever consider doing. Another one would be highlighting the need to increase the size of our Wikipedia. So we need to increase digital content. We need the public to get on board with that, be it through schools or universities or just individuals. We also need to let the general public know that there is a need for technology, and that after a while, if the technology is not there available to them, then suddenly people will start reverting to English, and there's your risk of digital extinction. And then also I wanted to highlight that Helen had localized the Ozobots workshop into Irish, which meant that we were able to disseminate that in the Gael School and that, which has a huge impact. And then the rest of the gang also helped out in those workshops very willingly. So it does play a large part in our work, and if not just highlighting to stakeholders that social impact is just as important as economic impact. The digital plan, so I mentioned this one before, due for publishing in 2020. Essentially, the Department of the Gaeltacht have asked us to develop a plan that will highlight from the next 5 to 10 years the immediate need for technological support for the Irish language, areas of research in terms of skilling up and so on. So we've covered 15 chapters of the main areas, and John Judge and I have contributed to this along with colleagues in Trinity from the School of Linguistics, Speech and Communication Sciences. And then finally, in terms of EU support in the future, many of you may be aware that in the end of 2008, the European Parliament endorsed a report by a Welsh MEP, Jill Evans, and basically she calls action for EU to actually be aware of digital language divide and make sure that smaller and lesser resource languages are not left behind as we move forward with multilingual technology. And it was an overwhelming vote, only 45 against, and I guess what they're saying is substantial boost to the campaign for digital protection of the lesser resource languages. So this would be good news for us going down the line. The MetaNet group have formed a new group, if you like, called the European Language Grid, which many people may have heard of recently. They've had some calls for funding, and so this is another good avenue for us in terms of trying to get more support from Europe. So in conclusion, I'm going to write these ones down. So I wanted to say that basically I wanted to highlight that we have come a long way since 2012, and especially in DCU. There's slow and steady progress, and that's a mixture of not having a lot of people around with the skills to do it, so then we have to skill them up, and then not having the data around, so we need to build the data and collect the data in the first place. It's important that we all share the same vision, and that will keep the momentum going, and if we all believe something can be achieved, we've shown that it can be done. Also, we need continued support, and financially and otherwise, from universities, from funding departments, and from the general public. And I think I should remind everyone that social impact is just as important as economic impact in terms of the reasons for doing applied research. So, Gurmila Magif.
Remarkable Fain. Teresa, thanks a million.
Oh, I went over later, sorry.
No, you're grand, and it's great to see everybody's in, all familiar names. So yeah, we're open for questions or comments, anyone who wants to jump in, and for everyone who's on the line, any of you guys who want to unmute and turn on video, you're very welcome to do that.